Good morning to all of you. Welcome to the first panel here on institutional structure. Already we have started, I think, the discussion a bit about this topic in the first presentation. I'm pleased that we have two very distinguished speakers here on this question of institutional issues. That Cecily Rose from the Leiden University, and Ian Tennant from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Unfortunately, we don't have a discussant, but I'm sure we will make up here in the room in a very interesting discussion and raise many issues which may arise or have already arisen in this context. Please, Cecily.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Professor Ferlati for this invitation. And I think it's very fitting that this conference is happening now in light of Italy's role in bringing about the conclusion of the review mechanism negotiations. So it's very nice to be here. I have some slides because my presentation will go on a little bit longer than 15 minutes, and I thought it might be helpful to have a few words on some slides to guide us. In my presentation, I'll talk first a little bit about UNTOC's institutional design, meaning which supports the conference. And then I'll talk a little bit about the activities of the Conference of Parties over the last 15 years or so. So that's a large period of time, so it'll be a rather bird's eye view. And then I'll talk about the basic features of the review mechanism and give some observations or my own thoughts about this review mechanism and treaty monitoring more generally in the field of transnational criminal law. And perhaps it's good for me also to explain that I approach this as someone who has admittedly spent more time studying the review mechanism for the UN Convention Against Corruption. And I also approach this as someone who's particularly interested in treaty monitoring, or sometimes the lack thereof, in the field of transnational criminal law. So first, the basic objectives of the Conference of Parties, they are to engage in capacity building and also reviewing implementation. And this is quite clearly set out in the Article 32 of the UNTOC, which provides that the conference is meant to improve capacity and promote and review implementation. And in order to achieve those objectives, the conference is meant to periodically review implementation, make recommendations for the improvement of implementation, and generally facilitate the exchange of information among states parties, and to gather best practices, broadly speaking. So in other words, the conference is meant to collect information on implementation and the difficulties that are encountered. And the conference can do this either itself, in theory, or through a supplementary review mechanism. And so I'll talk more about this as we go along. And it's also worth noting that states parties are actually obliged to provide the relevant information to the Conference of Parties. So the basic features of the Conference of Parties are, first, that it's a plenary body of all of the parties to the convention, which, as has already been stated, is 189. And the only existing commentary on the convention provides that, in a very brief paragraph, that there is little to say about this provision. But actually, it's prompted about 15 years of controversy. So I'm going to begin then by just outlining some of its basic features and then talk about what it's been doing a little bit over the last 15 years. So it's worth noting that it's a political body and not an independent body of experts. So it consists of individuals who are representing diplomatic delegations and are either subject experts or diplomats. And so it's not an independent monitoring body that we see, for example, in the field of human rights law. It also meets infrequently. So it meets every 2 years. Which means that while in theory the conference could the conference could engage in the review of implementation itself, in practice this is really not a realistic possibility given how infrequently it meets and the resources that are available to the conference itself. So the need, therefore, for some sort of supplementary review mechanism, I think has been clear from the start, but there's little guidance on what that review mechanism might look like from the provisions themselves, Article 32. These provisions in Article 32 are quite vague. And so this is complicated also by the fact that there's also relatively little guidance from the rest of the transnational criminal law field on what a review mechanism might look like in this field. So there wasn't necessarily a very clear path forward about what the review mechanism might look like. Within the larger transnational crime field, there's the International Narcotics Control Board, which monitors the implementation of a number of drug control treaties. And that's an independent expert body. And then with respect to corruption, we have the UN Convention Against Corruption and the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, which benefit from peer review mechanisms. And so that's a different model. So in other words, there are different models for how what a review mechanism can look like in this field. And so there wasn't necessarily a straightforward solution to what it should look like in the case of UNTAC. So now a little bit about what the Conference of Parties has been doing over the last 15 years. And I'll begin quite a while ago, between 2004 and 2006. There are basically two eras, as I see it. There was an era in which the conference itself conducted some review or some monitoring. And then there was a lengthier era in which the conference was trying to develop a more formal mechanism. So first, between 2004 and 2006, there were actually two informal review cycles that were carried out by the conference. So the conference began by trying to collect information itself. And it did this via questionnaires. So it attempted to get states to fill out relatively lengthy questionnaires about their implementation, et cetera. The information was on not only implementation, but also international cooperation, technical assistance, and protection of victims. So this did not go very well. There was a relatively poor response rate, despite the reporting obligation that I mentioned. So in the first cycle of filling out the questionnaires, less than half of the states responded. And you can see that then in the second reporting cycle, which I have here on the slide, the response rate was actually about a third. So there are various explanations that I've come across for why this didn't go very well, why the response rate was so low. I've read that first the questionnaires were viewed as too complicated, that they required too much coordination between national authorities in order to complete, and that in general, states lack the necessary capacity to even collect the type of information that should be reported, and that also there was just general fatigue about all of these reporting obligations. It's also worth noting that at this early phase between 2004 and 2006, the approach that was taken by the conference where there were problems with respect to compliance was to write letters. So the Secretariat would write letters directed towards each state that had some sort of identifiable compliance problem. And as you can imagine, this was not a terribly efficient approach, and so this was abandoned relatively quickly. And it was also viewed as a rather negative approach to focus on the specific problems rather than to look at the larger picture and provide a more contextual assessment of implementation and compliance generally. So these early reporting cycles were abandoned, and in 2008, a self-assessment checklist was introduced. And this also didn't necessarily go very well. And I've read that this is partly because of very practical problems, including availability in an insufficient number of languages. And so then by 2010, the focus of the Conference of Parties was really shifted towards trying to develop some sort of more formal mechanism and less on gathering information itself. Okay. So then I'll speak now a little bit about the long road towards developing some sort of more formal review mechanism, which began, I think, roughly in about 2008 and lasted until 2018, so about a decade. So there were 4 working groups which were established over the years successively for the purpose of creating a review mechanism. And the early discussions were about basic things like whether or not to create a review mechanism and what sort of basic form it should take. Should it consist of independent experts, or should it be based on peer review, like for the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention? There was discussion about whether or not to copy UNCAC's review mechanism. So basic things like whether or not to just copy the model that already existed were the focus of the early debates here. Of course, there were also debates on how to finance it and who to include. And as has already been mentioned, there were essentially 2 main points of controversy that persisted for many years. The first about the participation of civil society, and the second about funding. And so far as I understand, there's also a third point which factored into negotiations to a lesser extent, and that is the fact that these review mechanisms are burdensome. So I'll talk now a little bit about each of these points of controversy. Okay. First, about civil society. I think we're going to hear more about this, so I will not belabor the point. I'll just say that, as I understand it, there's been resistance to giving voice to criticism of the track record of states on fighting organized crime. There's also been, I think, resistance to oversight by NGOs, for example, of law enforcement and criminal justice activities. There's also the idea, apparently, that there aren't really civil society groups who are focused on organized crime who could play a meaningful role. And I think that that's really quite inaccurate, but that's an argument that I've come across. And I think it's worth contrasting this debate on the participation of civil society with the role that civil society does play in the human rights context. So in the review of, so for example, Universal Periodic Review does allow for the participation of civil society to a much greater extent than what we see with respect to UNTAC and also the Convention Against Corruption. So there is a real contrast there, and I'll maybe speak a little bit more about why that contrast exists later on. It's also good to note that there's a contrast with the Convention Against Corruption here. So the participation of civil society has been highly controversial for this convention as well. And civil society is basically limited to the plenary sessions of the Conference of States Parties that are biennial. So the participation of civil society for the Convention Against Corruption is very limited. Now, with respect to funding, as has been already indicated, we have a block of states, especially developing countries, that have been in favor of using simply UN regular budget money. And among this block is China, Russia, Pakistan, Iran, and South Africa. And then there's also been a group of developed states that are quite opposed to using UN regular budget money and in support only of voluntary contributions. And in that camp has been the US, the UK, Japan, and also Canada. And then there's also the issue of the burdensomeness of review mechanisms like the one that's been created. So undoubtedly they are burdensome, both in terms of financial resources and human resources and time. And the US has been actually one of the loudest voices, so far as I can tell, about concerns about how burdensome another mechanism would be. even though I should note that this is a problem more for developing countries than for developed countries. So this is much more of a problem for countries that simply don't have the staff to allocate towards reporting as opposed to focusing on implementation. Now, a few notes about the shape that the review mechanism has finally taken. So there are 16 principles in total that are meant to guide and shape the review mechanism. And I think that it's a long list, but we can sort of separate it in a way into states' anxieties and their aspirations. So we see on the one hand their aspirations in terms of the desire to create a review mechanism that is transparent, efficient, inclusive, and impartial. On the other hand, the anxieties come out insofar as we see that states also want it to be non-intrusive, non-adversarial, non-punitive, not produce any form of ranking, not interfere in the domestic affairs of states' parties, and respect state sovereignty. So perhaps you can see from those lists that maybe the anxieties are outweighing the aspirations somewhat. Now, with respect to the structure, there's a 12-year program of thematic reviews that's been set up for all states' parties. And it covers UNTAC as well as its 3 protocols in 4 phases that are grouped according to articles that are related thematically or in terms of their subject. Now, importantly, review can only proceed to the next stage if 70% of the reviews are complete for the current stage. So we can only hope that the response rates will not resemble those in 2004 to 2006, because otherwise it will be difficult to move on to the next phase. In addition, the process is meant to be conducted through an existing data management portal, which has already been mentioned, called Sherlock. And so this means that information on legislation, relevant cases is meant to be basically uploaded to this existing database. Right now, the database, which I sort of poke around sometimes, I see what's available, it's quite incomplete. So there is information there on legislation, on cases, et cetera, but it's by no means comprehensive. It doesn't cover all of the states' parties, and states' parties that have uploaded information haven't done so necessarily in a comprehensive manner. So there's still a self-assessment questionnaire that's meant to be completed by states as a part of this process, and the information then goes into Sherlock. And so at that point, there's a desk review, a desk-based peer review that happens, and that's carried out by 2 other states' parties. And importantly, there's no country visit. So the review happens only in an office and not in a meeting, in other words. And this is quite a major contrast with the Convention Against Corruption, in which there are week-long country visits that happen as a part of the review for every state party. And I think that this is a really significant difference. Of course, it's a difference in terms of the amount of money that this review mechanism costs, because site visits are, of course, really expensive. But I also think it might be very much to the detriment of this review mechanism that it doesn't exist, these country visits. Because as I understand it, the country visits for the Convention Against Corruption may have played some sort of role in triggering law reform at the domestic level. So as I understand it, sometimes in between the time that states fill out the self-assessment questionnaire and when the country visits take place, sometimes in that time span, some law reform has taken place because of the prospect of having a bunch of reviewers show up and assess implementation. So this is something that I think could be tested empirically and would be interesting to have more information on. But if this is the case, that we see a pattern with respect to the Convention Against Corruption, that the existence of the country visits prompts some sort of further implementation action, then the absence of that for UNTAC could be significant in terms of the general effectiveness of this review mechanism. So lastly, The country review reports are then to be submitted to the Conference of Parties, which has thematic working groups on each of the protocols, so trafficking in persons, smuggling of migrants and firearms, and also international cooperation and technical assistance. And then finally, the documents, the information that's put on the Sherlock database is confidential unless the state party decides otherwise. So unless there's a decision to make that information available. So with respect to, with respect to funding, as has already been noted, the funding will be from funds that are already allocated to UNTAC through the Conference of Parties. And states can make additional contributions if they so wish. And then with respect to civil society, the compromise that was ultimately struck is somewhat different than the arrangement for the Convention Against Corruption. So states parties are explicitly encouraged to consult with all relevant stakeholders during the self-assessment stage. So that includes NGOs and academia and the private sector. And then civil society is meant to take part in constructive dialogues after the thematic working groups have held their sessions covering the relevant issues. So in other words, the dialogues are meant to take place after the working groups have adopted their reports, which may be of limited efficacy, but I'll let you cover that. And then the civil society discussion is not meant to involve specific pinpointing of countries by name. Okay, so now I have just a few thoughts on why this took so long, which is something that I've wondered about for a while, and I was surprised when when the review mechanism actually came into existence. So these are just my current thoughts, and I would be very interested in hearing the thoughts of others around the table and in the audience. So my first idea is that, in general, issues of criminal justice have, relatively speaking, pretty low priority within the UN system as a whole. And so I think it can be said that domestic criminal justice is perhaps a uniquely sensitive issue for many states within the UN system, and it also hasn't been the subject of a great deal of international lawmaking prior to the Second World War. So we don't have a really extensive history of lawmaking in this area. And it's also, I think, lower priority than human rights. And maybe this is in part because, or maybe organized crime is a more sensitive issue, perhaps, because human rights law leaves states with a larger margin of appreciation, whereas transnational criminal law aims at harmonization, which could lead to perhaps more resistance among states, given that they're meant to all sort of harmonize to a provision that's sometimes relatively clear about how domestic law should look. We also see this relatively low priority reflected in the budget for UNODC, in the regular UN budget funds that are allocated to UNODC. So if we compare the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to UNODC, maybe this contrast becomes especially clear. So the Office of the High Commissioner has, from the UN regular budget in recent years, about $200 million, where UNODC has just over 22 million. So there's a really considerable difference there in terms of the funds that are allocated from the UN's regular budget. We also see, I think, general resistance or half-heartedness reflected among states, reflected in treaty provisions that are often relatively weak insofar as they're vaguely worded, and we see that certainly with the provision on the Conference of Parties in UNTAC, or provisions that are semi-mandatory or not mandatory at all. And then we also see that the general resistance, I think, reflected in insufficient political will for the conclusion of a review mechanism, which is why I think this took so long in part. Now, I've also come across the explanation that This review mechanism took so long because terrorism was much higher on the agenda after 9/11. And after all, 9/11 happened very shortly after the conclusion of this treaty, and arguably pulled attention away from UNTAC and its implementation. So in other words, counterterrorism eclipsed organized crime as an issue within the UN system shortly after the conclusion of this treaty. Now, I'm sure that this is partly the case, but I also think this explanation really only tells a fraction of the story, because it doesn't square very well with the fact that nevertheless, after 9/11, states did conclude the UN Convention Against Corruption in 2003, and then in 2009, they concluded the review mechanism. So despite the fact that terrorism was higher on the agenda, perhaps, there was more momentum with corruption. Okay, now my last thoughts are that, first of all, there are relatively few examples of treaty monitoring in the field of transnational criminal law. So treaty monitoring in this field is simply not necessarily standard the way it is in the fields of human rights law and environmental law. Now, there are, of course, other transnational criminal law instruments that benefit from review mechanisms, like the International Narcotics Control Board for the drug control treaties and UNCAC's review mechanism. But these are actually rather exceptional, and there's many other treaties that govern a whole range of transnational crimes that don't really benefit from a review mechanism. So as a result, there's not a great deal of precedent in this field, and there's no standard approach. And so the consequence of this was that in the early years, 2008, 2009, 2010, so far as I can tell from the documentation, there was quite a bit of time spent on surveying the possibilities, seeing how review might be carried out. And I think that the Convention Against Corruption might have sort of escaped this problem, because in the anti-corruption world, there was a relatively strong precedent established by the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, which was based on peer review. And so it made sense, or it was, I think, considered logical to sort of import this model into the review mechanism for UNCAC. And then lastly, I think that this might have taken so long because of the experience with UNCAC's review mechanism. This has been a really burdensome and expensive process, although I think it's also generated data, which is very useful. So states could have simply just agreed to replicate what was done for UNCAC, but there was resistance to doing so. And I think this stemmed from the cost and the time and the general burden associated with it. So I think I've spoken for long enough now, and I'll let you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I suggest that we move on to Ian now and discuss also civil society involvement in the review process, and then we have questions and comments for both presentations. I think many issues have been raised which need a very extensive and perhaps discussion in the coffee break.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, good morning. Is this on? Yeah. Good morning, everybody. My name's Ian Tennants. I'm from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. Thank you to Serena and everybody here for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to address the civil society inputs into the UNTOC review mechanism. And thank you to Cecily for providing the overview of the mechanism for Tanya's opening speech as well. For those of you who don't know who we are, the Global Initiative, which is an organisation that I only joined a month ago, so I'm still quite new, but it is a network of over 350 people around the world doing research and other field work to create innovative strategies to help in the fight against organised crime. There's a permanent secretariat of which I'm a part, where we have offices, the main office in Geneva. I'm in the office in Vienna. There's also offices in Cape Town and small operations around the world as well. I should also tell you a bit about my personal background because, as I say, I'm quite new to the Global Initiative, but also quite new to civil society. I actually spent the last 5 years at the UK Permanent Mission to the UN in Vienna. So I was leading negotiations for the UK on the establishment of the review mechanism in 2014, 2016, 2018, and all the working groups on the Conference of Parties in between. So I know all these disagreements about funding and civil society very well, and I'm happy to answer any questions about that after the presentation, but I'll focus my presentation on the civil society aspects. I think one of the main issues that I've seen both from the member state side and from the civil society side is the problem of how to bridge the gap between the real world problems that communities are facing with organised crime and the gap between that and the things that we talk about in the UNTOC Conference of Parties, which I can tell you are very far removed from those discussions and tend to focus on technical disagreements on resolutions and things like that. So there's definitely space for civil society to help improve the evidence base and bring more people to these higher level UN discussions. So in my presentation today, I'll cover broadly what we mean by civil society in this context, what the role of civil society is in this newly established review mechanism for the UNTOC, what the Global Initiative's plans are to lead the civil society input into the review mechanism, and how a new project that we have started at the Global Initiative called the Resilience Fund will support this work. So, I think you all probably know this already, but what do we mean by civil society? I'll start with the World Bank description, which would include community groups, non-governmental organisations, labour unions, indigenous groups, charitable organisations, faith-based organisations, professional associations, foundations, and advocacy groups. There are obviously lots of different definitions, and we are all here in the context of academia as well. But I think one example definition that is particularly relevant is from Kofi Annan's foreword to the UNTOC, which discusses the role of civil society against the uncivil forces which seek to destroy the social fabric, including organised crime. His view of civil society includes professors, journalists, political parties, and others who have an essential role to play in the running of any society. From our perspective, we think there are three main benefits of having civil society as part of these type of review processes. Firstly, increasing transparency and the independence of the reviews that are carried out. Secondly, by the involvement of the civil society, increasing public pressure and publicising outcomes. I think that's what Cecily was referring to with regard to the UNCAC, where civil society have been involved in the country review processes. And finally, peer pressure from other member states. So it's easier to pressure your peers when there's more information available rather than when you're in a process which is very tightly controlled and each member state can essentially censor what it is that's presented to the rest of the group. However, it must be also stated that it's some commentators argue that civil society involvement in these type of processes could have a damaging effect. Some argue it causes politicization, diminishes trust and openness in the process. Obviously, we don't agree with that, but I'll put it on the table for everyone to consider for a balanced discussion. With regard to the UNTOC and civil society, the final text of the convention provides little mention of civil society, but there is specific mention. In the main convention, there's a single clause that mandates the Conference of Parties to agree mechanisms for cooperating with international and regional organisations and NGOs, as well as agreeing a review mechanism. I think the UNTOC protocols, which we'll hear more about later today, address civil society more directly in guiding states to consider cooperation with civil society groups. I think the contrast with similar instruments with UNCAC, which has an entire article on the participation of civil society, is quite clear. With regard to the mechanism, Cecily already laid this out, but there are three main elements of the review. The general review, which is a kind of overarching process in the plenary of the Conference of Parties. And in this bit, civil society will be able to make statements in this section of the review. As has already been explained, member states are encouraged to consult with relevant stakeholders in the completion of their own review, and there is this constructive dialogue process alongside the thematic working groups. I think this is probably one of the main differences with the UNCAC, which member states, and speaking from my perspective from a member state side in the past, we would have regarded the UNCAC mechanism as quite closed, although there was the participation in the country visits. In the plenary, it was quite not very open, and there was an NGO briefing which was completely separate from all the normal review meetings, whereas with the UNTOC mechanism, there is the regular mandatory constructive dialogue, but it should be also recognised that this is once the official meeting has been finished and the report has been closed. So you can make your own conclusions on that. Our evaluation of the conclusion of the review mechanism is that we largely accepted that a comprehensive process, like on the human rights processes, was never realistic for UNTOC, partly because of the nature of consensus on which everything is agreed in negotiations at the UNODC in Vienna, where essentially one member state can have a veto. And, you know, alongside that, the resistance of some member states to having a kind of a civil society oversight of what they see as legal cooperation in an intergovernmental process. Yeah, as I said, the constructive dialogues, you know, can be seen as a positive development with regard to UNCAC, but that has to be balanced against the fact that they are outside of the member state meetings that will have already been closed. Based on all this, I'd like to talk to you about what the Global Initiative is planning on doing to help civil society engage in the review mechanism. We're the biggest single civil society organisation working on transnational organised crime, so we think we're quite uniquely placed to contribute and to provide support to smaller organisations who should be contributing and, as I say, bridging the gap between what's happening on the ground and what's being discussed at the UN. We see the role of civil society as most useful in bringing context to the implementation of the UNTOC, supplying analysis and expert opinion on organised crime trends, and bringing the experience of communities affected by organised crime to these meetings. I think this differs from the primarily legalistic focus of the formal review mechanism conducted by member states and the peer reviewers. We want to see an approach which situates UNTOC in a context of the impacts of organised crime in a way that will best support member states in decision-making on implementation of UNTOC and the future development of UNTOC. We see two key challenges to how we will get civil society voice heard. One is resistance from member states, as I mentioned before, and the fact that traditionally civil society working on organised crime are a very diverse group and not necessarily connected with each other in terms of expertise, geography, subject area. So, as is up on the screen, our three main points will be: we will produce a global report on organised crime trends for distribution as part of the UNTOC review process in the Conference of Parties in 2020. There is currently no equivalent report looking at organised crime across all its forms. We aim to capitalise on this opportunity by consulting both our network of experts, which, as I said, is over 350 people, and grassroots civil society organisations working on the ground. And we see kind of the role of this report as being a way in which we can use the review mechanism as a focal point through which we can push forward substantive debates and help contribute to the international agenda. Secondly, we want to work with select member states that are willing to lead structured civil society input to the reviews. This isn't something, that we've explored in detail yet, but I think it's an idea that several member states would be open to, as was expressed during the negotiations and as expressed in the terms of reference to the mechanism. We would want to use our network and our contacts to help in that way. Thirdly, we want to bring local grassroots civil society groups and individuals to the UNTOC review mechanism thematic meetings. We think we provide quite a good focal point between the diverse groups of actors and activists working on the ground. Together, these 3 points aim to contextualise the review of UNTOC in the observed trends of organised crimes and the real experiences of civil society groups working within their communities, which will ultimately allow member states to enhance their understanding of transnational organised crime. Before I finish, I just want to tell you a bit about a new project that we're launching at the Loibl Initiative, which is one of the ways that we will be connecting with civil society groups on the ground in the coming years, which will underpin the 3 points of the strategy that I've just outlined. This is something called the Resilience Fund, which has just been launched this year by the Loibl Initiative. The purpose of the fund is to build community resilience initiatives by supporting civil society protagonists on the ground as the first responders to the threat of organised crime. And these are people operating in very dangerous environments. We think the fund will put the weight of the international donor community behind such individual and community groups. The fund will equip them with the financial means, capacity building, and tools to seek innovative and non-state approaches to citizen security and to peace building. And as it says on the screen, there are 3 groups of people this is primarily aimed at. Firstly, independent journalists, investigative journalists working on the ground, activists working to highlight the dangers of organised crime and mitigate the threats of organised crime in their community, and community resilience initiatives, and by that we mean community groups, women's groups, religious groups, etc. This is initially funded by the government of Norway, who have provided $4.5 million for 3 years. This is the geographic spread of where we're looking at the moment. We have some projects already implementing south of Africa, signing off projects currently, Central America, North Africa, Southeast Asia, Western Balkans. And as I say, this is one of the means by which we would be able to help communities working against organised crime, but also help them gather data and help them improve the quality of the debate in the review mechanism to the UNTOC. I think I'll skip this one for now, but this is basically some of the background to how we will be implementing the fund. And just as a final sales pitch, on the Tuesday, 21st of May, any of you that are attending the UN Crime Commission, or the CCPCJ as it's called, the annual crime meeting at the UNODC in Vienna. We are launching this project officially with some very interesting speakers. So if you happen to be in Vienna on Tuesday, 21st of May, please come along. Okay, and that's it from me. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to both of you. They were very interesting presentations. I think lots of questions have been raised, and I open the floor for comments and questions. Please.
My name is Rosanna Garcia from King's College London. Thanks to the panel for these very interesting presentations. My question would be mainly to Cecily, but it applies to somehow also the way civil society organizations contribute to the review mechanism. You mentioned how cumbersome the process can be for states, and you also mentioned OECHR and all the treaties and all the review mechanisms. So sometimes a state may find itself having to report on very similar issues to different schemes, and the consequence of that may be in practice that the contribution to a specific review mechanism may not be that meaningful because they may end up using the same materials for different review mechanisms. My question is, given your observation of other review mechanisms and other treaties, what practices have you come across, or do you think would be advisable to encourage to avoid this problem, or to at least try to see how states could be more encouraged to actually have a meaningful contribution with the resources they do have? Because the dichotomy between having to devote resources to reporting and to actually implementing it is something that those in practice come across quite often. So what would be your view on this? And if there is any way civil society can contribute to this as well?
Actually, I think it's appropriate in this case for materials to be reused. So UNCAC drew very heavily in some respects on the provisions from UNTAC. And so I think it's appropriate for materials submitted to UNCAC's review mechanism actually to be reused for this purpose, and that that is efficient and in this case actually a good idea. And that is what is meant to happen. So there was discussion during the lead up to this review mechanism about how to make it more efficient and about drawing on what's already been done for UNCAC. So yeah, I gather that maybe you think that maybe that's not a good idea for materials to be reused.
No, I think it can be in this particular case, given the connections of the two
Yeah.
conventions. But in some cases,
Yeah.
I've come across, it doesn't
Well,
necessarily have to be.
Yeah, like the provisions, for example, on bribery, money laundering, and then the very lengthy provisions on mutual legal assistance, which is like a mini treaty within the treaty. Those things have already been reviewed within the context of UNCAC, and the treaty provisions are so similar that it makes sense to use what's already been done. Which then I suppose also raises the question about whether there could have been a single review mechanism dealing with both treaties. That ship has sailed, but I guess the sensitivities around the two conventions are actually not the same, and so it would have been difficult, perhaps, to build a review mechanism for both that would operate in the same way. But yeah, I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
I've just a question to both of you. When reading through Article 32, paragraph 4, it came to my attention that it says here a supplemental review mechanism. Did this play any role, this supplemental, in the negotiations and on this reporting issue which was just raised?
The word supplemental,
Yes.
as opposed to...
Just a review mechanism. Because if you look at other treaties in other areas, when the word additional, supplemental comes up, you always know that somebody else wants to keep control. So when I read through here, before coming down and I read the word supplemental, I knew, okay, the Conference of the Parties wants to make sure nobody is doing something they don't approve of.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that maybe can be one explanation also for why we don't have an independent review mechanism. So, of course, there's states parties exercise much less control over, or no control over, a body of independent experts. But here, that was never really seriously considered for this treaty. It was discussed in the early days, but that was never really, I think, seriously on the table. And so I think from the outset, it was clear that this was going to be some sort of supplementary body consisting of representatives of states. Does that get at your... Yeah, and then indeed states are anxious about retaining control over the way that this is operating. And there's also been, I think, quite a bit of emphasis, somewhat oddly, on this being an intergovernmental mechanism. So that's been really emphasized by some states. And maybe that's reflective of that language.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Serena, please. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this one working. Yeah, I think just to come in on that point that you just raised, and I can tell you from being in the room of the negotiations that any attempt to move away from that long list that you raised at the beginning of the intergovernmental, non-intrusive, non-ranking was just a non-starter, and that was the kind of holy foundation for some countries on any unsought review mechanism. That had to that bit of the UNCAC mechanism had to be copied. Otherwise, the conversation was just dead.
Yeah.
Thank you, Serena, please.
I have two questions actually, but one relates to this point and more broadly to the different kinds of review mechanisms that we see in place and the different ways in which they work. This is clearly a non-confrontational kind of mechanism, which, for instance, in the area of environmental law, has been perceived or construed as being more encouraging towards cooperation, and maybe some countries which are reluctant to outside scrutiny to be more cooperative. I think we find some hints in this respect with the work of the Universal Periodic Review in the framework of human rights law. Do you see these positive aspects as being possibly on the table also in the framework of the UNTOC, or is it just a way, choosing this kind of mechanism is just a way to avoid too intensive scrutiny? This is my first question. And a second question, which is perhaps very partial given my love for the International Court of Justice, but which role do you see for Article 35? I mean, I was quite surprised when I saw Article 35 used, which provides for the possibility of submitting disputes over the UNTOC to the International Court of Justice, but this has been used. It also provides some interesting information, in this case, Equatorial Guinea versus France, as to the way in which the UNTOC has been actually used, Article 18, even in the context of a very high stakes issue between the two countries. Do you see the ICJ pronouncement, for instance, of last June as being able to provide guidance in the interpretation of the convention by the review mechanism?
Well, I thought it was very interesting that there was this attempt to ground a case at the ICJ jurisdictionally through the Organized Crime Convention, and it didn't work, unfortunately. But nevertheless, there were some interesting remarks I thought that the court made about this convention, and in particular about the fact that actually the states weren't disputing. There was no actual dispute between the parties about the provisions, their interpretation or application. As someone who studies the ICJ as well, it would be very interesting to see a case like that go forward. But I don't know. It seems unlikely that in the future that will happen. But I would certainly be interested in seeing that happen. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, yeah, I don't really see the prospects of that kind of thing happening more often. I think it's kind of up to the states parties if they want to start showcasing it in more kind of innovative ways. It's up to them to do that because it remains an intergovernmental process. But I think, yeah, as I say, you know, as the global initiative of civil society will be focusing on kind of more on the ground impacts rather than the legal aspects that you're mentioning.
But do you think the peer review mechanism is going to be effective or can be effective, or is it just something? I mean, I know that you're working in order to make it effective, but do you think there is really a very big difference as compared to for instance, the human rights model in the way in which this kind of mechanisms work?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think there's a big difference, but you know, the important thing is that it now exists, and now there's, you know, a year and a half left of the discussions to make it operational, where member states and civil society have an opportunity to make sure that within the confines of what's been agreed that it is as impactful as possible.
Yeah. I suppose one thing I would also add to that is perhaps the worthwhileness of the review mechanism also comes down to how much information will ultimately be public. So in the case of UNCAC, not all, but many states have made a lot of information available. So for some states, we still have only very brief executive summaries, but for many states, we have country reports, and then for a smaller number, we also have the self-assessment questionnaires. And so for researchers like myself, that actually provides just a goldmine of information. Even though the reports can be very lengthy, not necessarily exactly harmonized with each other totally, and sometimes difficult to get through, but it's very useful information. And so I think the usefulness of the review mechanism for UNTAC will partly hinge on the extent to which states opt to make their information public. And I hope that they do that to the same extent that they have done for UNCAC.
Please.
I just want to make a comment. I'm Ugi Zvekic from Global Initiative. I have been in my life in 3 different positions. I was for a long time staff member of the UN, then I was representative of my country in the UN Geneva, and I worked in Human Rights Council for more than 4 years. And now I'm with Global Initiative Civil Society. So I have 3 different approaches and experiences. And I must say that and when I was working at the UN, I was involved, fortunately, in UNTAC drafting. And so I know how it all started from the very beginning. What I wanted to say that from my personal experience, what happened with UNCAC and UNTOC, there is not much difference between 2 of them, also in terms of review mechanism. These are minor differences. It's a big step backward in comparison to human rights. A big step back. Because the role of civil society is important, definitely in the fight against corruption and organized crime as well, as it is important in human rights area. And of course, I think we have to look at geopolitics of the time in which these conventions, first the Declaration of Human Rights was adopted, and these 2 conventions, and then the review mechanisms, because also the review mechanism of UPR was not immediately made. It took a long time, actually much longer than for these 2 mechanisms, mind you. But political climate was different. It was a climate of a decade after the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was a climate of, we all love each other. There will be golden opportunity for international cooperation. We will all cooperate. We have trust in each other. This is not the case anymore. Absolutely not the case anymore. And problems that Jan and Cecile were pointing out about the review mechanism, even more for UNTOG than for UNCAC, are actually a reflection, this is my perception, of a political climate of today. If you try today to pass any sort of convention in criminal justice area, but even in some others, it would be almost impossible. So the golden age of international cooperation in criminal justice arena is past. Unfortunately, it's over. And so we now have to live with the leftovers of the golden age and try to build on that. And I think the initiatives of putting more, involving more civil society in this is very important in order to improve also political situation in the face. I just wanted, I'm sorry, to make this very general comment, really based on personal experience, not on very serious study of it.
May I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
So do you think that, I have a question for you actually, if that's okay.
Yes, sure.
So do you think that there's anything in the substance of like human rights treaties as opposed to the transnational criminal law treaties that make states more resistant in the criminal law context? Or do you think it's merely about the larger political context? Does it not have to do with the actual provisions themselves, which for some reason attract more resistance from states?
I don't think these are provisions. I think this is the old ideology of sovereignty, which is very much linked with criminal law, right? One of the symbols of sovereignty of the country is to have its own criminal law, and that others do not impede on that, right? Do not interfere. That's why we have these strictly intergovernmental body without interference, without sort of, penalizing, telling you are not good. In human rights, it's different. Of course, in human rights, it has been politicized to such an extent, as you know, that the US walked out, which is a big, big blow to the human rights machinery as such when you have US walking out. But I'm afraid, that here it is politics as well, but also this ideology of criminal law representing a symbol of sovereignty of the state.
Yes, please, Irina.
Just a point of this, I also wonder whether this has to do with the way in which the human rights monitoring system has evolved. Because when it began, it was definitely not clear that it would turn out as it is working today.
Yeah.
And I think states were very reluctant, for instance, to appoint independent bodies in other areas because they were aware of what independent bodies could become, which was not what was originally envisaged, for instance, for the UN core conventions and so on. I wonder what this has
I think some states learned a lesson, and they said we will not allow it anymore.
I agree with you, because we have this problem in many areas of international law, not just human rights law, where we are stepping back as well. And we don't have, as you said, the trust anymore, which evolved after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when international lawyers still had something to say and say, we now move forward and build systems where we are not punishing others, but trying to achieve best practices. And that has worked, and perhaps we went too far. That states do not want it anymore in this area. And when you look at the environment, compare Kyoto Protocol mechanisms, complying system, what we have now under the Paris Convention, there's a big difference between the two. Please. Yeah, please.
Do you want to?
Sure. I mean, it's a, it's a fundamental question. We have the same discussions on UNCAC, and that's why it's it's so important to encourage and pressure member states to publish all the information, but also to encourage, when there are recommendations to follow up, to look at how that's being implemented. And I think, as I say, that's how we would try and contribute by building a more global picture of trends, which won't be, as we see it, produced by the mechanism on its own. But yeah, you raised some very important points about how much control member states have over their own review.
May I just add here a question? When you look at the review process, we have here the preparatory phase and then 4 subsequent review phases. Could that play a role, that states are more put focus on them what they have not implemented?
What do you mean, because it's so long?
Yeah, because you have different phases.
Yeah, this was one of the, as Tanya knows from having to put what member states were saying into practice, it was quite a difficult process to try and, within the constraints of how much money member states are willing to give and how much information for different legal instruments have to do it to get it into, I think even getting it into the 11 years or 8 years, whatever it is at the moment, was a challenge. But there's going to be a long wait before the process starting and any information becoming public, and that pressure being able to be put on those member states.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, and maybe to respond to what Theo was saying, I think that, it is, of course, it's a long fight then to even get information about implementation, but then that leaves unanswered the question about what's happening actually in terms of enforcement, and that's, I think, a huge unanswered question about what impact these treaties, in particular this one, are having on actual enforcement in the various countries. Yeah.
So you don't think what we have normally with such mechanisms that we say shame and blame?
No, not at all.
That won't work at all?
I don't think so.
Could I add just one thing so that we don't end on such a negative? No, I just wanted to say that it's true that there is no exact mechanism for follow-up on the results in order to measure whether they have been, the recommendations have been followed. However, the UNCAC review mechanism, for example, has effectively worked in the way that whatever comes out of the review processes then has translated into technical assistance and technical cooperation with the government. So basically, based on it, so it's like a needs assessment or a gap assessment, really. And so then UNODC and also other countries work with that country to really tackle the issues with specific programs or activities on the ground.
Yeah.
So in that sense, there really is a follow-up. UNCAC has been quite successful in that regard, and the programs have evolved. And initially, there were 2 programs at UNODC, one for the review mechanism of UNCAC and the other one on technical assistance. Now there are 1, so there's more continuity, and so this is something that obviously we hope comes out of the UNCAC review mechanism as well.
Yeah, if I could also add a positive note at the end. The state of implementation report that the UNODC Secretariat has produced on the basis of the UNCAC reviews, it's a relatively lengthy document, and I think also very valuable in terms of synthesizing the outcome of the reviews so far. And so if something similar is done then for UNTALK, that will be also very valuable.
As I see no more requests for the floor, I would say we move to the coffee break 5 minutes early or 4 minutes early. Thank you very much to the 2 presentators. Very interesting.